Hi everyone, this is the Hungry Math Professor here. Thanks for coming to my channel. And today I'm going to talk about Against Method by Paul Feyerabend. For the last time, this is part four, so we're going to discuss chapters 17 through 20 and the postscript on relativism, which completes the book. And in chapter 17, the heading of this chapter says, science and rationality are particular traditions unaware of their historical grounding. And this historical grounding part, I think, is similar to what Kuhn was talking about, though Feyerabend always takes things in a slightly different direction. But Kuhn also mentions that, the different scientific paradigms don't tend to understand the complete history of how they got to where they are. Generally, scientists are taught maybe the most recent history, the most recent paradigm shift, and Kuhn argues that when they're taught that paradigm shift, there's a bit of revisionist history to make the paradigm shift look like pure progress. But Feyerabend is not necessarily going to take that particular line of approach here. But in the very beginning of this chapter, he's trying to point out that well, he claims that science and reason are two very different things. What he's trying to say is that what he's been saying throughout the book is that science just doesn't follow the rules of reason the way you might claim. So that's why he's saying that you have to make a choice. Either you like science, in which case you have to accept that science is done in a very chaotic way, and that actually that chaotic way, which involves creativity and all kinds of different methods of persuasion between communities and all different kinds of happy accidents, and sometimes going against what the data seems to say and sometimes going against what the theory seems to say, so on and so forth. All the kinds of things he's been talking about in this book, that is not following any particular systematic, rational system that you put together. It's just not happening, and yet it works, and yet it seems valuable, and it seems like a great thing. He says either you choose science like that, or you choose rationality. It's like very rules based, say exactly how you should do everything and do it that way. Um, so he says you have a choice, right? And again, I think Feyerabend is against both of these choices in some sense. I think Feyerabend loves science. I think he's just a deeply curious person, and he wants to see science done with little or no rules being enforced at the largest level. But as we see as we go through this, he understands that we're going to need guidelines in place to, like, communities are going to pick guidelines, of course, but there shouldn't be these like overarching rules put on the entire community, and that every rule is can be broken when needed to, right? That's how I think we should think about this. Um, you can ask, like, what is rationality in Feyerabend's mind? I think as far as science is concerned, I think he has in mind, the logical positivists who are trying to take all of scientific language and turn it into these propositions, these like logical propositions, which can be true or false. And for the logical positivists, anything that goes beyond those statements that can be made in this logically precise way becomes metaphysics, and metaphysics is nonsense. And ethical claims from the logical positivist point of view are just claims of booing for something or cheering for it, right? That's how they claim. When you make an ethical claim, it's not a proposition, a logical proposition that can be true or false. It's simply something that you're either booing for against something or cheering for some kind of value, right? So that's what I think Feyerabend has in mind as a system of rationality. He also has Popper's school in mind, where he thinks of Popper as trying to put these guardrails on how science should be done, falsificationism. Popper is also famous for trying to distinguish between science and pseudoscience. And in order to do those things, Popper has to put down rules and structure for what science is. And so I think that's what he has in mind for rationality. But I also can't help but think about Wittgenstein's ideas and uncertainty in philosophical investigations, where, when I was taught philosophy in the analytic tradition, you're taught how any argument you make should have premises, it could have any number of premises. Um, and these premises should be things that can be deemed true or false. And then from the premises, the conclusion should follow logically. And there's rules of logic that are laid down that tell you whether a conclusion follows from the premises. Great. But then let's say you don't buy my premises, right? Let's say you have a different argument, like for whether God exists, for instance. I don't know. You have some premises for the fact that God does exist. I have some premises for the fact that God doesn't exist. Both of our arguments are logical because the conclusion follows from the premises for both of our arguments. Then what do we do? How do we make a rational argument about whose premises are better? Do we set up new premises and then try to make a new conclusion about whether my premises are better than yours? I mean, not really, right? We just argue about the premises, and that can be useful for like an organizing tool for how we should argue about these kinds of things. So I'm not poo-pooing this completely, but the point is that there's a rational system for arguing it, you could argue, but there's no way of objectively deciding whose premises are better. At the end of the day, you either buy my premises or you don't. I can make arguments and I can try to persuade you, but at the end of the day, you find them persuasive or you don't. And there's no like a system that I could use of rationality to judge whose premises are better. So what do we do, right? Again, for me, this I'm a math professor. I really value rationality, but every time I try to establish it on some firm foundation or read someone else trying to establish it, I must admit I'm unsatisfied because I want it to be absolutely, I want it to actually be established on a foundation, and I just don't see it, right? So it's not like I give up on all things, right? And Feyerabend's not giving up completely on everything, but I have to look for another philosophy. I have to look for another approach because I find that this approach that I want to work, this approach of logic and rationality that I want to work, when I analyze it completely, I'm always unsatisfied, right? So what can I do? And I think Feyerabend is right that when you look at science in history and you look at how it's done on an everyday basis, it's full of irrationality because it's full of human beings. It's full of people who have really difficult personalities sometimes, and then full of people who are just like really introverted and want to like stay in their lab and do whatever. It's full of all kinds of different people, and it's full of people getting into meetings and yelling and arguing and exerting their power and all kinds of stuff. But yet, as human beings, this tends to work out anyway, right? Not always, of course, but we make useful we are able to come up with useful knowledge nonetheless, right? So from my point of view, we should embrace this. I live in New York City. When I look around New York City, I see controlled chaos everywhere. I mean, if you look around, it's nuts sometimes, right? But yet it works. When I say it works, I don't mean everything works, but it's not like it's completely falling apart, right? This is what I call controlled chaos. When you start zooming in on the details, all you see is chaos. But when you zoom out, you realize somehow this chaos is coming together and actually working, to the point where it's not like, complete chaos would just, eventually just fold in on itself and it wouldn't work for more than a couple days, right? But New York City's still going, right? But it's still chaotic at the same time. Sorry, that was a long sigh, but I think it is relevant to what Feyerabend's saying. And certainly I've been reading this now for 4 weeks and I discuss it with my philosophy discussion group. So when you do that over a book, it starts to wash over you and it starts to creep into your thoughts and you're constantly having these conversations with yourself. And that's what you want to do when you read a book like this and you discuss with people. Let it become a part of what you're doing and have conversations about, challenge it, challenge Feyerabend. But I really do appreciate these 4 weeks to think about and discuss this. Um, he keeps bringing up this idea that something I bring up as well in myself, that people want black and white truth. They're not comfortable thinking that their practice is just another one to try, right? Because he brings up this pragmatic approach, which is something I'm very much a big fan of these days, where, we look at all the different approaches to science or all the different approaches to life, and we pick the one that works. And these different approaches are just things that we can study and think about, but we don't have to establish them as like some kind of black and white truth. But honestly, when you look around at people we want to believe that the things that we are committing ourselves to are black and white truth. We want to think that we found, um, the answer, right? And even if when I press you, you'll admit that you haven't found the answer. When I look at how you live your life, it's clear that you are, in some sense, deluding yourself into thinking that you found the answer. And, the word deluded is a very negative word in this context, but maybe that's just useful. Maybe that's okay, right? Like somehow it just organizes ourselves and focuses on a particular task. So maybe this isn't all bad, right? But from my point of view, I really want to see us able to embrace the gray area of life, but not have it cause an inability to make action either, right? That we can appreciate the gray area of life and the fact that there are no answers, there are no clean answers to anything, and yet still live and still be productive. Um, you know, when we think about what's going on in Feyerabend, he's constantly being accused of being a relativist. So in the postscript on relativism, I'll just jump to that since it's in my mind. He he discusses this, right? And you have to remember, Feyerabend or any philosopher over the course of their life is also thinking about their ideas, challenging their ideas, and hence their ideas are going to change over time because they realize that they made mistakes or they don't like the things that they said 10 years ago or 5 years ago, and they realize that they need to adjust, right? So part of what Feyerabend is saying here is that there's no way, like you have all these different traditions of science or different areas of science or religion or different myths or different cultures, so on and so forth, all these different practices. And he says that like there is no way of judging one to be better than the other when we're just zooming out and looking at them all. There's no like Archimedean point where you can sit and judge them as like an arbiter in some objective way. And so, in some sense, all these traditions, as he says, are neither good nor bad, they just are. And that seems like some kind of absolute relativism where I don't know what to do now, right? Because everything is just as good as anything else. So, how am I supposed to act if that's the case? I think it's important here to remember that when we're talking about this absolute relativism, we're really zooming back and trying to ask if there's some objective way to compare all these things. And in some sense, what we need to do is get rid of this notion of objectivity altogether. It just doesn't make sense. I understand why we want it. I wanted it too, but it's just not possible. And so instead, what we need to realize is that we never make decisions from that point of view. Instead, I make decisions relative to me. I make decisions relative to me. Of course I do. Right. And but that doesn't mean I'm not talking about completely selfishly. I make decisions relative to me and relative to my family, relative to my friends, relative to the school I'm in, relative to the country I'm, so on and so forth. All these different communities that I find myself a part of, I make decisions relative to those things. And so I'm allowed to make decisions relative to those things. So even though, like from some really zoomed out perspective, all traditions are they can't be arbitrated in some objective way. I'm not coming from that point of view, right? I'm coming from my own point of view and the point of view of the communities that I'm a part of. So it doesn't create inaction, right? And again, there's this pragmatic part of me that wants to say, we're going to find what works, right? We're going to try things, we're going to make mistakes, we're going to adjust, and we're going to find what works. But I think what the productive part of the relativism is to say that when you look at someone else's community, you can judge that. This is something that Feyerabend talks about. You can judge them as an outside observer. When you do that, you tend to take your own values and your own interests and judge the way that someone else's culture or perspective or tradition is working according to your standards. Oftentimes, that's going to cause this other culture to lose because you're evaluating them on the wrong standards, but not always. Sometimes, via your own standards, you'll see some other culture and say, you know what? they're doing better than us in the way that we in the things that in from things we actually value, right? And so we might try to learn something from them, make some adjustments. Um, but he also talks about you can also um, try to be a participant. You ask different questions when you're a participant versus an observer. And this goes back to something that Feyerabend talked in part three is that, when you try to be the anthropologist and study, different scientific communities or different cultures, you don't just try to evaluate that culture from the outside. You try to actually immerse yourself and live the way that these people live to try to get a sense of why they do the things that they do. Um, and we can take that same approach, right? So he also talks later on about when different traditions come in contact with each other. When he says traditions, it could be different areas of science, different approaches to science. It could be religion and science, like it could be things that different. It could be different countries, different cultures, all kinds of different combinations. It could just be people within the same country with the same culture, but with very different political beliefs, so on and so forth. How are we to talk to each other, right? He talks about how you can have a guided exchange. And when you have a guided exchange, then you have to agree about the rules of the exchange. So that could be like some rules of rationality. So you can imagine like the analytic philosophy tradition might say that this is the way that you produce arguments or, different. The problem with that is if you both are well, it's not a problem if you both come from like a similar tradition and you want to argue a similar way, then you can have a guided exchange like that. But if your traditions are different enough, then this sort of guided exchange is not going to work probably. It's going to produce um, just kind of fighting, right, or yelling at each other. So then he also talks about something he calls an open exchange, where both sides try to like fully embrace, at least for a moment, the other person's point of view and try to like immerse themselves in those ideas in their ways of thinking. Again, it doesn't mean you have to give up on your values. It doesn't mean that at the end of the day you won't stand up for what you believe in, but it means that you try to put yourself in that other person's shoes. You try to, you know, put down your rules for a second and adopt their rules and see how that works. This kind of thing. And it really reminds me of something I think we really need right now. And I can only really talk about the US from a participant point of view. I remember when I took government in, I think, 11th grade, uh, we did this thing where we were encouraged to debate each other on particular political views, but we were also encouraged to take the point of view which we did not agree with and try to argue that point of view. And this is a common thing. You may have been asked to do this in some class at some point. I think this is a homework assignment that America needs in general. The United States needs to do this homework assignment over and over again until we learn something. So I'm a math professor. I have the right to give you a homework assignment. Here's your homework assignment. I think it'd be better if you find a friend or someone in your life that you can do this with. But if you can't, you can do it yourself. But try to find somebody you can do this with and find a point of view which you all disagree on, whatever it may be. You can start with something that's not as cantankerous as abortion or something. Find a view that you disagree on, and then swap views and try to argue for those views. There's your homework assignment. And let's keep doing that over and over again until we find a way to talk to each other. Because I'm honestly just tired of our inability to talk to each other. And it seems like we just assume everybody's a bunch of idiots if they don't feel the way that we do, right? And well, Feyerabend is not talking about this particular problem. I can't help but be inspired to talk about it from his point of view. I think he sees science from his, he's writing this in 1974, but then he keeps updating it until 1994. Um, I think he just sees science. It's not that he doesn't like science, he just thinks it has too much power over society. And especially maybe in that point in time in US history, whereas we think about it a little bit differently now. And so he doesn't want science to become tyrannical. Like it shouldn't be an oracle that we like, come and sacrifice and and see what the oracle tells us to do, right? That's what he's bothered by. But the same thing I can say about, the right versus the left in the US. We both seem to think that we have completely figured out how things should be, and we should just submit to the oracle of conservatism. We should submit to the oracle of, the left liberal kind of idea. And if you don't, then you're just an idiot, right? And that doesn't work. And it's not going to work. It's just going to produce anger and fighting. And that's exactly what we're seeing, right? And that's just not how a democracy works. A democracy requires us to get to the table and compromise and figure out a way forward. So I didn't expect to talk so much about that, but it is something that came up as I'm reading this over and over again. And it is something that came up in our discussion as well. So I think it is, I think Against Method was not written for that in mind, but of course I'm reading it and my group is reading this right now in the political realities that we're facing right now. So this is what Against Method is producing in our minds, right? And isn't that so beautiful how you can write a book and you have no idea how it's going to affect people later on, right? Positively or negatively. And that's true of everything we do. I really like this analogy to art, at least from how I see art, which is when I approach art, I don't try to figure out what the artist is trying to say. There's nothing wrong with that. But I'm really into abstract art and these things that don't have these very clean answers. So instead, when I approach abstract art, I just want to see what it makes me feel. What does it make me think? And I wanted to just start a conversation. And I feel the same way about when I read books, whether it's philosophy or whether it's novels. I just want to see how it makes me feel, how it makes me think. And the success of a piece of art or a book is not whether it's right or wrong. It's the wrong question, or whether I can tell exactly what it's trying to say or not. The success of it is whether it creates new thoughts, new interesting feelings, and whether it just kind of furthers the conversation that's going on in my head. That's what I'm looking for, right? And I think from that point of view, Against Method is extremely successful. Some people are going to find this book frustrating because he is kind of all over the place and he's intentionally not laying out a system for you because he's against systems. So it would be kind of contradictory if he laid out a system for you, right? Um, and he sometimes seems to contradict himself, completely. But I think what Feyerabend is trying to do, he calls himself a Dadaist, in the artistic tradition. What he's trying to do is he's saying, inside of you, you have this system of rationality. A lot of us have this system of rationality that we think is, objective and the right way to do things. And he said I think he's just going around, he's saying, I need to break that up because it's just not true. Like I need to break that up inside of you, cause some confusion, and then you can put the pieces back together in a productive way. But I need to get rid of this idea inside of you that thinks that you can produce some like completely rational system, right? Okay, let me try to get through the rest of these chapters. Obviously, this book has created a lot of interesting ideas for me, and so I can't help but just kind of talk more generally. But I do want to make this video about Against Method, so let me keep going. Chapter 18, he says, yes, I believe in this relativism of ideas to some degree, but it doesn't mean that it's not possible to evaluate and improve standards. So he's saying, like, as a community, you're going to pick some standards, you're going to pick some approaches because we have to organize ourselves. We all have values. Like a research lab is going to have a different feel depending on who is leading that research lab, what their personality is like. Some are going to be much more strict about things than others. Some are going to be involve much more rules than others. And you're not going to avoid this. And there's nothing wrong with it. In fact, that's totally in line with Feyerabend's point of view, which is, anything goes. Some people can do things one way, some people do things another way, and let the controlled chaos happen because they'll come together and produce this beautiful fruit, I think, from Feyerabend's point of view. So he wants to remember that he talks about, because Feyerabend calls himself an anarchist a lot of times. And he says, like, there's this naive anarchism that says that rules have their limits. And then from that, they say that all rules are worthless. And he's saying, I am not a naive anarchist. I think that all rules have their limits, but I don't think that all rules are worthless. That's a ridiculous claim. It's too strong, right? It reminds me of what Wittgenstein was saying. He Wittgenstein talks about this rule following paradox all the time. For Wittgenstein, language is just not precise enough to put down rules that could possibly govern all situations that we're going to come in contact with. And I think Feyerabend is similarly saying that. But that doesn't mean we don't put down rules. That doesn't mean that these rules can't help to guide a community for a certain point in time. It just means that when we bump up against something where the rules don't really apply, we make adjustments and we don't calcify ourselves to the rules to the point where we do dumb things because we can't realize that we need to just change the rules, right? And the same thing's true of science, right? We put down these theories in science until they don't work anymore, and then we change them, right? And what's wrong with that, right? That's what's more pragmatic than that, right? Like these rules can always be changed when they need to be, when they're not working anymore. When they're not working can mean lots of different things, like when they're not working for the community, when they're not in line with our values anymore, when they're not in line with what we're trying to accomplish, right? They could still be giving us good results in the lab, but if they're not in line with what we're trying to do as a society, then we can choose to ignore these things when there's something else that's more important in mind. I think this is important, right? And it also points to this sort of naive relativism that he wants to reject as well. It's like, I do think you're going to put down rules, you're going to put down structures. Just remember that those structures are not some kind of objective truth. And as soon as you need to change them, you should change them. You should be open to changing them and adjusting. I really like this. Um, he talks about how he keeps when you don't change, when you just calcify yourselves around rules, he loves to compare to like religious um, people that do that. And the reason why he's doing that is he's trying to get you to realize that you're making the same mistakes. Science at times when they calcify themselves around rules or they represent themselves as black and white truth and some oracle that society just needs to just submit to. He keeps trying to remind us that you're doing the same things that religion does that you hate. You're doing the same things that you hate that religion does. And what makes you different than a religion when you do that? When you try to submit yourself as some sort of oracle that society is supposed to just listen to, then you're making the same mistakes that all kinds of different institutions have made in the past that you also disagree with. Okay, going into chapter 19, he brings up an idea that he's brought up again, which is that in a democracy, in a free society, science should be separated from the state. Here, I'm not so sure that he's ever going to give us a way of like completely separating science from the state. I'm not even so sure that he wants like a complete separation. Of course, we have separation of church and state in the US, but the truth is it's never has been or never will be a complete separation because that's just not how people work, right? You can separate it via the law, but you're not going to be able to separate it in society. And anyway, so I'm not so sure that we should read him as saying a firm, complete separation. That's just not, he doesn't even really give you any way of doing that anyway. But in this part, in this chapter, he wants to ask sort of three questions about science, which is, what is science? Well, I honestly have to read this again, the question. So, yeah, what is science? What's so great about science? And how are we to use the sciences? And who decides the matter? So, it's the second to last chapter. And so he's really going to pointedly come around to these things. Of course, he's already talked about these things in the book, but he's coming around and in chapter 19, really hitting it in this very direct way in this chapter, which is having to do with the separation of science and state. So, when he says, what is science? His conclusion is you can't give this sort of like firm definition. Popper tried to give a difference between science and pseudoscience, and it didn't work. And, anytime you try to give like a complete systemization definition of what science is, you're going to fail. He's saying all you can do is list out some things. And this was Wittgenstein's point as well, that when you go to define what language games are, for instance, he can't give you a perfect definition. All he can do is give you examples and hope that you can extrapolate because, he thinks that that's how you define anything is you just you can use language to try to define relative to the people who already use that language. So yeah, we can give definitions in that way. But when you try to do it in a philosophy, you're trying to give a definition somehow that applies to everything, and you're going to fail. So all you can do is list out the sciences in some way. You can't try to completely define them. So that's his answer to what is science. What's so great about science? He says science sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. So he is a big fan of science because I think Feyerabend is just a very curious person. And science is a beautiful way of trying to understand the world around us. And so we shouldn't stop being curious. But again, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes when it works, like we have computers now, and we have phones that can do all kinds of things, and the internet, and we're working on artificial intelligence. In some sense, those things are science, and all the different things that go into making these things happen are working because I see them, right? Their computers exist, the internet exists, but that doesn't mean that it's working in some broader sense. It doesn't mean it's making society better, right? It doesn't mean that we're better off because of it, right? And so um, science sometimes works, sometimes doesn't, and sometimes when it works, it's good or it's bad or it's neutral. It's it again, all these things come from a perspective. Um, and he talks about how though the love of truth is one of the strongest motives for lying to oneself and others. He keeps trying to remind us that when we try to present science as absolute truth, we run into the problem of being willing to lie about what the data says, or being willing to lie about what the maybe not even on purpose, but because we've become so entrenched in this belief that it's true that we're willing to sacrifice anything to convince other people or to persuade them or to force them via our power and our influence. And we need to forget about that. And at the end of the chapter, he talks about how he specifically talks about the Japanese, but I'll talk about it in a slightly different way, which is like there was lots of different societies that non-Western societies that had their own cultures that we could say were good or bad, and we can analyze them, but they had their own culture. So he particularly talks about Japan in the 19th century, but you can apply this to other cultures as well. And they had to Westernize, and the reason he claims, and I think this is, historians would agree with this, the reason why they had to Westernize was not necessarily because Western culture is better. Of course, he points out how the Japanese found, Western science to just be barbaric, this sort of abstractions, and treating nature this way just seemed like barbarism to them. So you may ask, why did they Westernize? And what Feyerabend points out is just because it's because Western weapons were so effective, right? It's because they wanted to survive, and they didn't want to be destroyed by these countries which had these horrific, weapons that could kill people so easily. So it's not that Western society was better. It's because, or the science was creating things that were better. It's because they they needed to survive. And the what you can say is that the weapons were better, right? But is that actually better in the grand scheme of things? Does that make better people or better societies? Is that helping us live a more meaningful life? Like, I'm not so sure that it is, right? I think there's many reasons to think that it isn't. And his point about, this Japanese in 19th century is that they literally had to get rid of things in their culture which were serving them well, right? Or at least serving some people well, right? There's always sort of winners and losers to these things, and we need to acknowledge that. But it's not like Japanese culture at that point was just like completely in need of Western salvation or anything like that. There's lots of things that were working and working for different people. We should remember that. And, it's this interesting reflection on just how much science just, oftentimes produces really great weapons. Is that really what we want from science? Is that really what we're so proud of? That we were able to create the atom bomb and all this terrible destruction? That's not, I don't think what motivates scientists as a mathematician. That's not what motivates me. But don't I have to take seriously the fact that that's what a lot happens, whether I directly am interested in that or not? That this sort of like pursuit of science and rationality has created just all these different ways to kill people. effectively, and should we be proud of that? I think Feyerabend wants to remind us of that over and over again. So, sometimes science works, sometimes science doesn't. Sometimes it produces great things, and sometimes it produces terrible things. And, to question three, he says, a community will use science in a way that agrees with its values and aims. And as soon as science does not agree with its values and aims, it should reject it or should adjust it, right? And what's considered scientific versus non-scientific should be decided by that community and not by some oracle of science which tells us, what things are, right? It's always going to be relative to some community. Okay, let me move on to chapter 20. Chapter 20 is a short autobiography of Paul's life, mostly focusing on his academic life. So I won't recall the story. It's a very readable chapter, so I'd encourage you to read it, even if you read nothing else. What's interesting about this autobiography, he kind of goes through all the different schools and all the different philosophers and scientists and artists that were influential on him in different points in his life. What's interesting, though, is to realize that Feyerabend really wanted to find like a rational system for science. Like he was very much attracted to the logical positivists at first. It's just that eventually he realized it didn't work and he had to move on. And then he was influenced by Popper and he was, I think he was influenced by all these, he was also influenced by realism, right? Wanting to believe that science could get after, truth and that it was actually getting after truth that was really out there in the world. And he wanted to believe in these things, but the more he looked at it, the more he tried to make it work, he just kept being disappointed and he just kept being influenced by other ideas and realized that it just didn't work, right? And I think this is true of a lot of philosophers. I think this is true, you can say to some degree of Wittgenstein, that you may want like this objective truth and some system which can accept objective truth to work. But if you keep trying to make it work and it doesn't, at some point you have to question whether it's possible, right? I think that's similar to like the trajectory through science that, or to try the trajectory through philosophy that I've had is I would love to see some like a system that can establish truth. In some sense, I think you could argue that's why I'm attracted to mathematics and that's why I'm a mathematician. But I also want it to actually be truth. I don't want to just delude myself into believing that. And so the more times I try and I see that the philosophical system doesn't work, the more I have to, try to adjust and see if there's something else out there. And I have to let go of these illusions and these delusions of objectivity and make sense of the gray area of life, right? What's so wrong about that? Maybe I'll finish this discussion by reading a quote which occurs at the end of chapter 20, which I really like. And this will be my way of ending my discussion of Feyerabend's against method. So this occurs at the end of chapter 20. And he says, another possibility is a change of subject. I started my career as a student of acting, theater production, and singing at the Institute for the Methodological Reformation of the German Theater in the German Democratic Republic. This appealed to my intellectualism and my dramatic propensities. My intellectualism told me that problems had to be solved by thought. My dramatic propensities made me think that hamming it up was better than going through an abstract argument. There is, of course, no conflict here, for argument without illustration leads away from the human elements which affect the most abstract problems. The arts, as I see them today, are not a domain separated from abstract thought, but complementary to it and needed to fully realize its potential. Examining this function of the arts and trying to establish a mode of research that unites their power with that of science and religion seems to be a fascinating enterprise and one to which I would devote a year or two or three, dot, dot, dot. I like this thought. I'm a mathematician, as you know. I am very much attracted to mathematics and science and philosophy, but I'm also very much attracted to art and music and these things that just make me feel things. And I want to combine these things because I want to be a mathematician who makes people who can influence people's feelings, that makes people feel inspired. And I think that means that I need to learn from artists and people who write novels, people who write poetry, about what it means to inspire people. I can't just sit in my office and do mathematics on a board. I need to understand what it is to inspire people, how to tell a story. And that's not something you learn in math education. It's something you learn, I think, in science education. But telling a story is so important because at the end of the day, there is no objectively rational argument that you can make. There just isn't. All you can do is tell a story and try to influence people and hope that they are interested in what the story you have to tell and try to influence the community and build, something together. So, I want to be a mathematician who understands that. I want to be a mathematician who realizes that I need to be a storyteller too. And I need to make art and I need to make beautiful ideas and I need to encourage and inspire people. And I need to learn from music that sometimes all it does is just make me feel good, make me want to dance, right? And anyway, I'm not going to bring this into a solid point, but I love that Feyerabend is so willing to combine these things. So often, as mathematicians and scientists, we want to separate ourselves from the art world and the humanities because it just feels like chaos over there, and they're just saying whatever they're willing to say, and we're over here doing this objective thing. And I think this is a real mistake. It's not that we should, completely knock down the walls or whatever. Mathematics is going to be mathematics, and I'm not saying we should, you know, devolve into some kind of anarchism or anything like that. But my point is just that we can learn from our brothers and sisters and who understand how to tell stories and understand how to inspire and understand how to make people feel things. And I want to see some kind of beautiful synthesis of ideas there. Let me stop there because I can just keep talking and rambling about this. I think it's beautiful. You'll probably hear me talk about it in other videos. Let me know what you think. If you made it to part 4 of Against Method, good on you. It's a lot of videos, a lot of discussion, probably a lot of similarity things. If you did make it through all 4, please let me know what you think. What do you think of Feyerabend? Read this. Let me know if you like it or not. And like, comment, and subscribe. And I hope to see you at another video.